Okay, welcome everyone to the first professional development session for the co-sponsorship program this fall on acculturation. And as I said just a couple minutes ago, the response to this has been outstanding. We had over 97 people register for this program. So we don't want to waste any time because we have a lot to cover. So before we do that, I would like to introduce our panelists. First and foremost is Naji Aldeban, who was resettled by a community group based in Manchester in 2016. And he is going to be offering us his very authentic perspective on his experience. And also we have Dr. Judy Durham, who some of you may know, but Judy used to be the leader of the Manchester group that resettled Naji and his family in 2016. And she will be leading this session with great authority as both a former co-sponsor as well as a professor emerita of multicultural counseling from St. Joseph's University. Just to give you a little bit of how this is going to work, please refrain from putting questions into the chat until towards the end of the program, as there are a lot of subjects that are going to be covered, and it's possible that your question may be answered in subsequent slides so that we can make this as efficient as possible. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Judy Durham, who will be taking over the program. But before I do that, I want to acknowledge my intern, Maddie Brink, who is going to be providing technical assistance for us this evening. Okay, Judy, please feel free to unmute yourself and take it away.
Good evening, everybody. Greg, are you going to put me on speaker view, or is somebody going to do that?
If you'd like me to start the presentation, I can, and then you would be in speaker view. But right now, you'll be a box at the top of the screen. That's just how this works.
All right. We tried to take care of these technical difficulties before, but you know, we didn't quite get them all. Okay, so why don't we just go ahead and I'll add to that introduction once we get started.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Can you see the slide?
I can.
Okay.
Why don't we go to the next slide? You'll see, by the way, that there is a person missing. Reem El-Haji, who has been in this country about 6 years, was originally going to be part of this presentation, but she, in fact, is sick this evening, as is her youngest daughter. So I have lots of information to share from meeting with her and Naji, and I really appreciate how much time they took and how much I really gleaned information as a response to those discussions. The book that I have put up here on this slide, Welcome to the New World, is actually a book that talks about Naji's family's arrival into this country. They arrived the night that Trump was elected, and he'll say a little bit more about that when we talk about some of the fears that the family had relative to coming to this country and discrimination. I want to also add that I've been studying issues of culture and primarily the interface between culture and mental health for all of my professional career, and actually even some before that. I've taken students to Guyana, South America. I've worked in Bhutan, and issues of culture related to whether it's resettling refugees or mental health issues have always held lots of interest for me. And it was that I sort of wanted to share some information with you, because I don't consider myself as an expert, but rather as somebody who is still learning. There's so much to learn, both relative to other people's culture, but also relative to our own culture and the values that we hold. And it's some of that that I'll be sharing with you tonight. So this book really tells the struggle of Najee's family in their arrival in this country. And if any of you are interested, it's available through Amazon. Next slide, please. So this is a brief outline of what we're going to do this evening. You'll notice that this presentation is really focused on us rather than how to help the refugees acculturate into this country. It's easy for us, for most anyone actually, to identify the cultural beliefs and values and biases of others and other people's culture. But to stand back far enough from ourselves to be able to see that we too contain and hold on to those biases and those beliefs, and often those deepest held cultural values and biases are below our level of awareness. And it's those values that are out of our awareness that often create the disconnects between ourselves and others, the places where we are actually trying to impose our values on other people rather than to find out how to find that common space where their values and beliefs and customs are respected, and where there's a match with how the dominant cultural beliefs and values in this country are enacted and work, and etc. So that's going to be the focus of this presentation. It's a little bit different than probably the other presentations that you've heard from Iris that are more focused on helping the refugees actually acculturate to the values in this country. Next slide. One of the things that we're going to do relative to issues of culture are to take a look at some of the proverbs and values, aphorisms, however you want to describe them, that you hear all the time, such as the early bird catches the worm, because there's often elements of what's important and what's valued within a culture that are reflected in these proverbs or aphorisms. We'll get to those actually towards the end of the presentation, but as we're going through, if you have thoughts of some of these, jot them down in the same way that you'd be jotting down questions and waiting to see if you get the questions answered. So jot them down, and if at the very end you haven't figured out where some of these proverbs might fit in what we're talking about, you'll be able to just write those in the chat too, and hopefully we'll have time and we can discuss them. Next slide. So this is a slide that depicts that the problem of cultural bias is much bigger than who we are personally. It's also a reflection of the fact that the United States is a rather arrogant nation, We're number one in the world. How many times have you heard that? We have the best, we have the brightest. But our paternalism towards other countries, which is reflective of that attitude, often gets in the way. There's that belief that we'll just come in and we'll save you. We don't know anything about what you need, but believe me, we're gonna take care of it. We lack in cultural humility. So in preparing this presentation, I saw an article in an editorial, actually, in the Washington Post that I thought I would share with you because it's reflective of the notion that we are a very arrogant country, lacking in cultural humility. This was an editorial written by a former Afghani combat interpreter who served alongside US and Afghani special forces. He asserts that it was our cultural illiteracy that led to US failure in Afghanistan. Although there are probably, many folks in the US who, don't believe that, who wouldn't believe that, because in fact, we did pour billions of dollars into Afghanistan. Even the fact that we poured billions of dollars in is reflective of another US cultural value that money can solve anything. We did build roads, we built schools and clinics and governing institution, we gave them military equipment, etc. And all that's true, but what we never did is get to know the Afghani people, what they valued, what they wanted, what they thought would be helpful. Rather, with our arrogance, we made assumptions of what they needed and what the solution was. We never did try to understand their culture. And that's a great example of our cultural arrogance. And so I hope as this presentation goes on, you'll understand that we all share a bit of that cultural arrogance. It's very common to think that your values are the most normal and natural and correct values in the world. So that's not unique to the United States. It's unique to being human. The problem is when it defines everything that we do without the ability to stand back and think about there might be another way of doing things or thinking about things that is equally as valued, carries as much weight, etc. So the lesson here is that we all need to develop a little cultural humility. Next slide. This slide is a picture of, and as I said, many of these pictures are taken from the book Welcome to the New World about Najee's family. This is a picture showing that our own cultural lens is the lens that we all use with anything that's unfamiliar. This is a picture, I think, of Najee's dad thinking about his kids sitting around eating food and sitting around on the floor eating food. We all knew when we were setting up the house for the Najee's family that in fact they probably didn't sit at a table, but Iris said, get a table. And so we did. And we put it in the middle of their kitchen, got a table big enough that would accommodate a large family, squished it into a space that was hardly big enough to accommodate a table for two. And that was all okay. But the problem was we never talked to them about it. We never said anything relative to the fact that we knew this wasn't how they were used to eating meals, but it was how folks in the US eat meals. And that's a small thing. It's just an example of a surface culture. It's not a deeply held value. But if things aren't acknowledged as being different, it's much more difficult to talk about the deeper cultural issues where there is difference. So this was kind of our first error. The first night, not acknowledging that there was any kind of cultural difference. Next slide. This is a picture of the components of culture or cultural worldview or worldview/culture. I'm going to use these terms interchangeably, although there are certain academic differences between the notion of worldview and culture. For our purposes, they're kind of irrelevant. I use culture, and many of the other folks who use that term see it as an umbrella term, which encompasses all of the social, the behavioral norms found in human societies, as well as the knowledge and customary beliefs and values and capabilities and habits, as well as material traits such as art and architecture and institutions, just to name a few. What isn't referred to here is an association with any ethnic group. It is true that certain ethnic groups hold certain cultural beliefs in common. However, what's also important to know is that there are as many between or within group differences as there are between group differences. So if you get a group of people who are all from, say, Scandinavia, to use a different kind of example that we wouldn't ordinarily use, we can't expect every single Scandinavian person to share all of the same beliefs and values, although there might be some that they share in common. So when you learn about the culture of the refugee family that that you will be assisting, don't assume that everybody within that group holds all of those values, because there will be differences. The other thing that this slide doesn't depict, which is equally as important, is that there are cultural affinity groups. Affinity groups like religious groups or people who identify as LGBTQ or trans. These are groups of people who share a certain commonality of values and beliefs related to some other perhaps variable related to something else, like gender or sexuality or religion, etc. So not all of the cultural variables that we're going to talk about are just things that can be ascribed to an ethnic group or a geographic group within a certain region. Cultural variables also different in relationship to certain affinity groups. So now what you're also starting to see is that there is an overlap. You might belong to one affinity group that shares certain values that are different from your ethnic group or different from your religious group, etc. So it gets complicated in terms of understanding an individual or a group of individuals just by the category of culture when we define culture narrowly versus when we're defining culture broadly. So the next slide shows pictures evidencing surface culture. Culture is often understood as an iceberg, that the smallest part of the iceberg exists above the surface. Perhaps 10% of cultural values exist above the surface and can be seen through things like food or dress or a flag, or whether you sit at a table or not. The rest of culture, the deeper part of culture and the deeper part of values are below the surface. Sometimes that iceberg is divided up into 3 sections, and below the next section is a section called shallow culture, and that might be 20 or 30%. This is the next slide. So shallow culture, as I said, is the next 20 or is the top 20 or 30% of the deep culture. I pulled out some pictures related to shaking of hands. Naji was instructed by some of the folks that he encountered exactly how to shake hands. I never thought about the fact that there is cultural variability to the way one shakes hands. And then I started thinking about, there's the Queen's handshake where you put your hand out like that. Then there's the manly handshake where, like Naji thought his hands was being caught in a vice grip. And that was even remembered by Naji when he was shaking hands with the school counselor. He remembered to give a good, strong grip. And then there's the notion of handshake that is reflective of the deeper meaning that is ascribed to touch in the Islamic culture, where a man is not allowed to touch a woman, even a handshake, regardless of whether she's a Muslim or not. This is all part of a deeper belief of maintaining modesty between the sexes. And this is very descriptive of how an example of shallow culture, in other words, males, Muslim males not shaking hands with females, is really reflective of a much deeper value. I can remember knowing all of this when I met the Aldebans at the airport and going through, oh my God, I'm not supposed to shake his hand. What shall I do? And finally, Ibrahim stuck out his hand, and so I shook it because he originated it. So I thought, okay, that's what I'll do. So this gets at an important piece of information, which is not only that shallow cultural signs often originate from deeper cultural beliefs, but the other piece of that is don't make assumptions. We should never make assumptions. we have to discuss difference, figure out what's going to work, what our values are, what other folks' values are, so that, you know, things will be more equitable. So deep culture, and this is the next slide. Deep culture are those things that we don't necessarily see or understand, both about other people as well as about ourselves. And I was thinking about this as I was doing this presentation. I was thinking about it in terms of, I knew that the Audubons came from an extended family structure that was very important to them. I knew that they came from a collectivistic culture, and we'll talk more about that later. But I don't think I really understood how deeply excruciating it was for them to make the decision to come to this country without their whole extended family as they wanted to. Nor did I really understand why Najee's grandmother said that she was not leaving before all of her children were able to leave. So in the last slide, you see Ibrahim and his brother, and whose family also arrived the same night, arrived in Connecticut the same night, the night that Trump was elected, talking about the fact that they were going to leave their mother behind. And you can see the pain in terms of how awful this was for them. So I think that, you know, this is a great example of not only are our deep cultural beliefs and values often hidden, it's difficult for us to really comprehend, to really see from other people's eyes what their own deep cultural beliefs and values are. And putting ourselves in other people's positions, I think, is it's hard. It's not easy to put yourself inside another person any more than it's easy to understand what our own biases are and to make sure they don't sneak out, because they will, and they do. And I have several examples of that happening. When I was talking about this with both Najee and Reem, let's see, they shared with me something from the Quran, a couple of things from the Quran, and Najee's gone, I think. I don't see him anymore. Or I would ask him to say more about this.
You could ask him to mute himself, then you'll be able to see him.
Oh, okay. Najee, can you unmute yourself?
He actually was out of the room and now he's back.
Okay, all right.
So.
Sorry, I got disconnected.
It's okay. So, Najee, I was talking about when you and I and Reem were talking together, and you were sharing with me God's message to Muhammad from the Quran that says, take care of your mom, and your father. And then the other message of that one must keep connecting with one's family. I was basically sharing how I didn't really understand the depth of that until the three of us were talking. And would you add what your grandmother asked when she finally did arrive in this country a few weeks ago?
Absolutely. So if you can remind me real quick, was that which topic?
That was when we were talking about how I couldn't understand the closeness within your family, and that these two verses from the Quran helped me, but also then and you were also sharing that, your whole family had lived together in Syria, you'd all fled to Jordan together, you'd lived together in Jordan, and then your grandmother arrives here and asks.
Yeah, I think if I remember correctly, she if it was my grandmother, but the saying that I still remember is that when someone asked the messenger Muhammad, who should I take care of the most in my life? And then he told him, make sure you take care of your mom. And then he said your mom, and then your mom, and then your father.
Yeah. And when you arrived, your uncle and family were settled in New Haven, and you all were settled in Manchester. And so your grandmother couldn't understand that.
She was, and she's still upset about it. We try to go every week or 2 weeks, but she's like, I thought we were gonna be together after all this 5-year disconnecting, and all of a sudden now I have one son with his family living an hour away, and the other son living, in a different area. And yeah, she was very shocked to see that.
Yeah, and we wouldn't. Gosh, my kids live halfway across the country. I would think they were right next door if they were an hour away. So it's a really different headset that it's hard to wrap one's mind around it if we haven't lived in it. And that's kind of the point that I was trying to make when you were disconnected. Thanks for sharing that, Naji. So next slide. This is a little childhood book from my childhood that says how old it is, and it's basically it talks about how important it is to understand difference. And I thought this was a really good way to think about what we need to do and what we should always be doing, not just as co-sponsors, but just in the general course of dealing with other people, is to understand who they are not from how we would understand things, but from how they would understand things. We need to take off our cultural lenses, suspend our judgment to be able to really assist folks with acculturation, and to do so with fairness, with equity, with impartiality. We will constantly be wanting them to do things our way. And that's natural and that's normal. In this book, there's a refrain that goes, "It all depends on the way you look at things," said the Churkandoos. What happens is that the other animals in this story come around and they're all looking at this funny creature on the cover from their own perspective. The duck is looking at him and going, "It's not a duck." And the goose is looking at him it's not a goose, and the turkey's looking at him. It's not a turkey, and the chicken's looking at him and going, it's not a chicken. They're all looking, trying to figure this out from their own lenses without being able to stand back, suspend their own judgment, and to look at this creature for who it is, rather than from some preconceived notion of what animals should be from who, who the looker is. So it all depends on the way you look at things, said the Chircondees. And what I said in terms of understanding and looking at things from our own perspective, and that being the most natural and normal thing in the world, is called either egocentrism or ethnocentrism. They're both referring to that intuitive feeling or belief that our way is best and correct, and that there's a belief in the superiority of one's own cultural group. That's the ethnocentric bias. So, everybody does this, but what's important is that we understand that we do that, and that we have to all work hard to suspend our own automatic ways of looking at the world, taking off our lenses, so that we might be able to see others without our own biases, which are going to be there. Next slide. Okay, in terms of what something else that we need to think about relative to understanding other people is understanding how deeply within the fabric of this country discrimination is. We are a very racist, sexist, classist, ageist society. We need to understand that. Being white means that we own a market share of the power and the privilege. Many of us, I know, have been fighting for years to overcome many of these isms, but they're all in us and they're going to sneak out. Those of us who grew up in this country, in this culture, and who are white, are going to have to know that that stuff is in us, and it will sneak out, and it's going to sneak out when we're least expect it to. What's also important is that as co-sponsors, we're going to need to be able to know that this exists so that we can help the refugees navigate this. Discrimination is out there. We probably, as the group that settled Najee's family, didn't do a very good job talking about this. Najee, do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Absolutely. So, many examples really showed that most of the time we try to, hoping that this will help covering it up, not talking about it, that, it's something that we shouldn't talk about, that, it doesn't really help, it's out there, especially when we were taught how to use the bus. The first thing that we thought about is going out with my sister and my mom who wears hijab, and being out there exposed to more things that could come up. For example, someone who doesn't like Muslims or women who are wearing the hijab, and that was difficult, to have to do every day. And that was one of the things that really we thought there should have been more communication.
Mhm. Yep, I agree wholeheartedly. There should have been a lot more communication. Absolutely. So, I mean, there's many lessons here. One is watch out for our own cultural biases relative to these isms, and that's no small task. Talk with the families that we're working with, acknowledge their fears, acknowledge the discrimination that exists out there. Let them know how difficult it would be in any new country to know what's really safe, and help them sort it out, and help them get to a place of acceptance. Like Reem shared with me when she and I were discussing this, there are bad people everywhere, and that's the truth of it. And they exist here, they exist in every country around the world. And so what's going to be most useful is acknowledging that there are bad people here, that there are people who are going to evidence any one of these isms, and then helping folks figure out how to navigate that. Where are they going to be safe? Where are they not going to be safe? How can they find a place in this society where they can feel safe and just step back and know that bad people exist everywhere? Next slide. This is a picture that I'm not going to talk in great detail about. There's both of these pictures are actually pictures of Buddhist death ceremonies, rituals around things like birth and death, etc., are great examples of culture and cultural difference. And so in Buddhist societies, I've said I've spent a lot of time both in Bhutan and in Guyana, taking students to Bhutan and helping folks in taking students to Guyana and helping folks in Bhutan develop their mental health system. And the more cultural distance there is, in other words, the more cultures are dislike our culture, that means there's a greater cultural distance. The closer cultures look like our culture, that means there's less cultural distance. So the greater the cultural distance, the more likely there will be cultural misunderstanding, and the harder it is to suspend our own deeply held cultural beliefs, because we don't necessarily even know where they're going to come in conflict. The reason I use the pictures of cremation ceremonies is that one of the things in Buddhism is that death is just a part of life. And so people aren't expected to grieve. They aren't expected to cry. There'll be a puja, which is a religious ceremony, and then there'll be a cremation ceremony. And I went to one of these cremation ceremonies where there were 10 people being cremated at once. And each family had altars of pictures of these individuals. And then you go around and you look at all of these little altars and you give an offering to the family, usually money. And look at the pictures of the deceased. And so I'm walking around looking at all these pictures, and half of these people were like way more than half my age, and many of them were kids. And I got about 2/3 of the way around looking at these pictures, and I couldn't help myself. I was crying. And that's because I come from a culture, not only that that's a normal reaction in response to death, it's also a culture that values emotional expression, not a culture that values emotional restraint. I had the hardest time pulling it in. It's something that I really felt like I had no control over, because I've spent 70 some odd years valuing emotional expression, not just because it's a cultural belief, but it's also part of the profession that I've been in. So anyways, the greater the cultural distance, the more cultural misunderstanding, and the harder it is to suspend our deep cultural values and beliefs. And this also shows something else, which is that it's much easier for young people to adapt to a new culture than for someone who has been steeped in their cultural beliefs and values for years and years and years. So next slide. This is a picture that shows something that would be very common in any collectivist culture. Family all gathering together in times of hardship, strife, not just in times of festivals and celebrations, etc. This is when Najee's father and his brothers were in jail, and so the women or kids were left back home, and they all went over to Najee's grandmother's house. It was automatic. Nobody had to ask permission. It's just what happens in a collectivist culture. Some of the other values related to collectivist culture is collectivist. We all know they value groups rather than prioritizing individuals. And it's collectivistic cultures automatically seek what's best for the whole collective. Preserving harmony and being dutiful is valued over uniqueness and autonomy. In contrast, in individualistic cultures, obviously, we're very highly motivated by human independence and freedom. I'm going to give you a couple of examples, and then I'm going to ask on the next slide, when I talk about individualism, I'm going to ask Najee to share something. But two of the examples that I picked that are things that are certainly things that it would be highly unlikely to see in the United States. The first one is that a little over a year ago, Najee's family bought a house in West Hartford. And that was made possible because both Ibrahim, Najee's dad, and Adiba, Najee's mom, and his sister, Amal, and him's Najee, all worked together, saving money, earning money, and saving money to make this happen. It's a rare occurrence in the United States that kids would help out parents in buying a family home that everybody would live in. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it certainly wouldn't happen. It certainly wouldn't happen when you've got two kids still in high school who are contributing in such a major way. So the second example is that both Naji and Amal are going to go to Yukon, or it started Yukon this fall. And they chose to study the same things so that they could help each other. Naji says he's better in English and that Amal's better in math. And so they have their own little study group. How often would that happen in this country with siblings? I'm not saying it would never happen, but that they would choose to go into the same professions so that they could support each other through school? Unlikely. But my guess is, again, reflective of their more collectivistic orientation. Then the next slide is a picture, in case you can't figure it out. It's a picture of a man pulling himself up by the bootstraps. I thought this was a pretty good reflection of our rugged individualism, where we're all taught, we must pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, by ourselves, as though one could. But anyway, this is a country that was built on freedom from tyranny, from cruel and oppressive governments or rule, and rugged individualism. A real pull yourself up by the bootstraps, I can do it myself, no oppressive government needed philosophy. And you see all of that still reflected in our government and in our society. It's also a country built on the supremacy of white people. And we all know what we have done to Black people in terms of enslaving them and how we've treated indigenous people. I don't need to go into that. But it's a rugged individualistic society built for white people. That's the culture that we live in. It's each man for himself. It's not a focus on the group. It's on doing whatever you can, even if you have to step on people to advance yourself. Naji, you want to talk a little bit about this?
Sure. So, after going through it, I think 90% of immigrants and people who come from a collectivist culture, their biggest fear is that they or their children lose that culture. And that happened to my family too. My parents always wanted us to make sure that we keep it that culture collectivist enough, where even at times when we needed the money the most to pay bills, my parents said that Sundays are for family, where we go to my uncle's house. At home we only speak Arabic, because they were afraid of losing that culture, that collectivist, and helping each other.
Yeah, thanks. I don't think we necessarily think about how distressing it is to really value that collectivist orientation and coming to a country where you do have to worry about, are my kids going to continue to honor and respect this? And what about their kids? And what I can also say related to that is that research seems to show that the more deeply held cultural values exists through 4 generations. That's on average. The things that wear away most quickly are the surface kind of cultural values, like the decision to wear or not wear a hijab is more likely to wear away quicker than, say, holding on to a much more collectivistic orientation. Let's see. The other thing that I wanted to say is that in addition to deep cultural values shaping how people respond in the world, the other thing that shapes all of us is anything that happens during times of high emotional arousal. That anytime there's high emotional arousal, learning will happen. It's not always positive learning, but learning is going to happen that impacts people into perpetuity. And that came up in this example. The next slide, Greg. And I'm going to talk more about the title here is Trauma and Issue. But first, Naji, do you want to talk about this picture and how you came to draw this picture, etc.?
Sure. To be honest, I've never thought about it when I actually drew it, and I was very surprised to see it in Jake's book. I didn't. I wasn't talked about it before, so when I saw it, it was like a shock. Like, why would I draw something like this? And it came to my mind that this was what was in my heart and my brain, and what was worrying me the whole time. That's why when I drew it, I felt like I needed security. I put a lot of security dogs, a lot of looks like animals on the windows to watch, and a gate and security guard outside. This, after I thought about it, this is all out of the insecurity, the hard times that we went through, and feeling not feeling safe.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And to add a few graphics to that, if you don't mind, while your dad and his brothers were in jail, your whole neighborhood was being bombed constantly. And you and your cousin and eventually Amal, you all had to go out and find ways of making money and feeding the family. And you were doing this at a time when, the city was being bombed, and you were doing lots of stuff that wasn't necessarily safe, but you had to. You were told by your grandmother that you were the men of the family now, and you had to provide for the family, and you did. So it's not surprising that issues of safety were deeply embedded in who you are. And this is what I mean. And when Naji and I talked about this, I shared with him that it doesn't always take a huge catastrophic event for all of those feelings that are inside to come back. All it needs is a teacher saying, draw a picture of the house you'd like to live in someday. It's like, there it is. Safety was what was inside it. And Naji, do you remember the other thing that you told me that you did probably as a result of issues of safety being inside of you?
I thought at some point in the house in Manchester, I actually asked my dad. I said, I heard that you can get a gun in the U.S. And I actually asked him, because we didn't feel safe. We were waiting at any point the door would be knocked and someone would come in. Like, I would wake up in the middle of the night and find my mom awake, sitting in the kitchen. Because we've been through a lot, and we've definitely saw a lot of things that woken us up. Like, we always would wake up on bombs, on our house shaking, never knowing when will our house be next to be blown up.
Yeah. And one of the other things that you shared with me, Naji, is that you think that this concern about safety was probably also why you started going to the gym and working out, so that you could be strong to help keep yourself safe as well as your family safe. That
Yeah,
makes-
to be honest, that's what, like, the main reasons that I started going to the gym, and it really helped.
yeah, yep, absolutely. So what I talk about here is basically that, you know, any kind of learning that happens when there's high emotional arousal, and fear is certainly high emotional arousal when you're fearing for your life. Any kind of traumatic experience that creates that kind of fear often lives inside of people. There's a primacy that happens relative to extreme fear, extreme emotions, a primacy that happens relative to trauma. And at any moment, it can come out, sometimes with something as little as draw a picture of your house, and sometimes with bigger things as well. I'm not going to go into lots of detail with this next example, but it's in the book. At one point, let's see, the family had been there 4 months, I think, when you received a very profane, vile phone call, death threat phone call. The message was left on Ibrahim's phone. The message was lengthy. I heard it. It was horrific. And it basically said over and over in a bunch of different ways, I know where you live, and the person did have the correct address. I will kill your whole family if you don't leave this country immediately. Well, for a family that has that kind of trauma inside of them, and let's face it, anybody who comes to this country as a refugee probably has a backstory of trauma. People would not be coming to this country if everything was fine and dandy in their home country. People only leave their home country when it's a matter of life and death. What happened was, as a result of that death threat, there is no way that the house that they were living in would ever feel safe. It didn't matter that, you know, the police, the FBI, we all shared with them that, in fact, the real threat was probably very minimal. It didn't matter. There's a primacy of what happens inside of people when they live through traumatic events. And when it gets triggered, rationality sometimes goes away, and people just need to do whatever they need to do to be safe. And it was subsequent to this that the family moved to West Hartford, which I think was a much better decision for them anyways, but that's another part of the story. So understanding this about refugees and asylees, that they've probably all experienced trauma, otherwise they wouldn't have fled their homeland. What should we do with this information? First off, I think it's important to acknowledge that fact. Not that you have to ask them about what happened, just acknowledge that you know that they lived through some horrific things. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't be here. And what that does is it lets them know that if they want to discuss it, they can, that there's not an elephant in a room anymore. You're not saying that they need to discuss it, that they have to discuss it. You're just acknowledging that, in fact, we know you've lived through some pretty awful stuff. And we want you to know that we know that. We also want you to know that you don't have to discuss it, but if you want to, you can, just so that that elephant is not in the room. And then there will be a space so that if they start having nightmares, or the trauma comes back to them in some other kind of way, they know that they'll have a listener who can appreciate what it is that's going on with them. Let's see. All right, moving on. So I guess the bottom line so far is that both trauma and deeply held cultural beliefs and things that are learned in times of high emotional intensity have a primacy against all other more surface stuff. Okay, next, how do we deepen our understanding of culture and move beyond cultural biases? This is kind of straightforward. Never assume that you understand where a belief or an action is coming from. Always discuss it. Always, always, always. Don't make assumptions. And we often made assumptions about things, and we should have just discussed them. Know that discrimination exists, that we probably hold some of those beliefs, and be willing to acknowledge that we hold some of those beliefs, and know that they might leak out. Make sure you have open conversations about discrimination and bias, and be culturally curious, willing to suspend your automatic cultural lens, and develop and demonstrate cultural humility. This is the point where we were going to do questions, but given the size of the group, as I said, we would like you to just write those in the chat. Again, if you have questions now, if you want to just jot them down yourself so that you remember them. And then, you know, as we go through a few more slides, if it seems as though those questions aren't going to be answered, feel free to write them in the chat, and Maddie will keep track of them. This is also a time where I would like you to write down any of those proverbs or aphorisms that you might have been thinking about and haven't written down, so that you can keep track of them to see where they might fit. Okay, dimensions of worldview, categories of cultural variables. When I started putting these slides together, I thought that we would have time to talk about all of these. Clearly we don't. I don't even think we have enough time to really do justice to the first three, which I was hoping we would, but we are going to at least skate over the top of the first three, because I think it's within these first three that most of the disconnects happen, both of the errors get made relative to our cultural differences between ourselves and the refugees that we're working with. So the first category, next slide, shows a big clock, because we are a very clock-based, clock-oriented society. We learn this really young. When you're getting ready for school, even a kindergartner hears, hurry up, you're going to be late. And then we arrive at school, and if you're 1 minute late after the bell, you get marked tardy. And if you get too many of those tardies, then there's going to be consequences. Like, God forbid, you'll be sent to the principal's office. So, our learning about a clock-based orientation begins, very, very soon after our entrance into the world. The reason I put this other picture here is because I think it's a great example of how we learn about culture. We learn about culture by watching other people, by following their example. It's like we learn it by osmosis, through imitation, through our socialization. We learn from family, we learn from friends, not by being taught, but just by watching, by imitating. And so here's this little kid who's trying to imitate and assume the position of people in prayer. Not everybody in the world is so focused on time, but as I said, we certainly are, and we're very focused on clock-based time. Listen to some of these proverbs. There's no time like the present. Strike while the iron is hot. The early bird catches the worm. Carpe diem. He who hesitates is lost. Don't put off to tomorrow. What can be done today? Don't, sorry, I'm working off 2 screens here. Procrastination is the thief of time. That was by Charles Dickens. A stitch in time saves 9. Time and tide wait for no one. Early to bed, early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. And a similar one from Bhutan. It's a disgrace to the sun god to rise before she, or to rise after she, sorry. So issues of time and timeliness are all over our culture relative to these proverbs or aphorisms. And the notion of rising early is also deeply embedded in our culture, by probably left over from our agrarian society. But it's clearly shown by a friend of mine who said, no self-respecting person would ever sleep past 9 a.m. It's like, really? But that's how deeply embedded some of the issues related to time can be. So different from a clock-based society is a much more flexible orientation that happens to be event-based or even a cyclical orientation. Event-based means that a person finishes what they're doing before they go to the next thing. And so if they get there 10 minutes before, 10 minutes later, half an hour before, half an hour later, it doesn't really matter because they're around the time. And there's the assumption that, there isn't a definitive start time, but start times are suggested. I can remember years ago when I worked in Hartford Hospital's outpatient clinic, we used to have a Spanish clinic, a clinic for folks who spoke Spanish that would happen once a week. And it would begin, I don't know whether it was 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock, but anyway, some people would show up at 10 of, some people 10 past, some people half past. And it didn't really matter what the social worker who was in charge said. That's just what would happen, much to the chagrin of the secretary who would check them in, who wanted them all there at 5 of, so that by 10 o'clock, they would be all checked in and they could go down to the group. What that also says is not only were they coming from a culture that had a much more flexible concept of time, it also takes time to learn a new way of doing things. There's going to be a learning curve. So when it comes to issues of time, I think we need to understand that many people who are coming to this country from other cultures, it's going to take them a while. I know that this is something with the Audubons we talked about a lot, but recognizing that there would be a learning curve, we also accommodated for that by shifting the time when we told them we'd be there to pick them up. Knowing that, you know, if we said we'd be there at 10 o'clock, they probably wouldn't be ready to leave until 15:15. So we would tell them we were getting there at 15:15, so that we could, you know, we could accommodate for that gap while continuing to remind them that we really need to leave the house at such and such a time to be at the appointment at another, you know, at whatever time it was. So it was one of those things that rather than assuming that they would get it right away, which nobody gets something new right away, you know, it all takes us time and practice. We sort of allowed for that learning curve and adjusted while continuing to teach. So it was one of the times that we might have done it right. Cyclical time is something that is, you know, much more present in indigenous cultures, people who have a much more earth-based mentality. If you think about seasons, cycles of the moon, et cetera, et cetera. That's what a more cyclical orientation to time is. And the one expression that sort of matches that is what goes around comes around. Next slide. When I was thinking about clock-based time, I was wondering, so I wonder how many other countries are clock-based and which ones are, and are there countries that are more clock-based than us? So I Googled it, like you can Google everything these days. And this was a continuum timeline that I found where the countries on the left have a much more clock-based orientation than we have. If you can see, we're about a third of the way down that timeline. Whereas the people on the far right have a much more flexible notion and understanding of time, which also says that the timeline for people that exist on the far right end, the learning curve for them might take longer. Whereas somebody coming from a country that's on the far left, they're going to be ahead of us in understanding this. So just, it's the notion that there's variability both in terms of the orientation to a clock-based society and also the time that it will take people to adjust to a clock-based society. Next slide. There are many, many components of social relationships, and I'm gonna skirt over these really quickly, hit the highlights of some where I think that there might be the most difficulties. In terms of family, I mean, I think we all understand the notion of the nuclear family, the extended family, which is the one under the blue arrow, and the notion of tribe. And the notion of tribe was really new to me, and I developed a deeper understanding for what that meant when a bunch of us were working with an asylee who came to this country. And what I realized eventually was that in a tribe-based society, your family is often judged by where does your family historically come from? Who are the tribal people that your family historically comes from? And is that tribe valued within the specific cultural group that you're in, or is it at the low end of the totem pole? Almost like you could set up a caste system based on tribal allegiances. And I also discovered that some of the actions of the asylee's dad couldn't be judged based on their seeming they initially seemed as though they were just actions towards him, this asylee, but in fact, they were actions that would ingratiate him with a member of the government so that it would enhance his position. There's a whole new learning about family. I got extended family. I understand collectivist families, but a tribal ranking was something totally new to me. Marriage is another one of those things. This is the next slide, Greg, sorry. Marriage is one of those things. Next slide. Yep. Marriage is one of those things where you see evidence of surface culture where the more deeply held beliefs are below the surface. What I've also learned is that there are huge cultural differences in marriage, not just related to the more deeply held beliefs, but superficially, whether there's a civil contract or whether there's a religious contract, whether there's both, whether or not people even bother with a ceremony, whether or not people register their marriage civilly with the state or not. I hadn't really thought about that until I got to Bhutan, when I suddenly discovered that as soon as a person moves in with another person, they consider that person their spouse, their husband, or their wife. It's like, oh, okay. And only a small percentage of people in Bhutan have any big celebration, festival, religious ceremony. That the vast majority of people just go and have a basically it's a civil ceremony that just sort of marks this down with the state as record. A lot of people don't even do that. Just sort of interesting. It's like, huh, I didn't know about that. So, you know, when we hear the word marriage, we think certain things. Also, one of the things relative to marriage that we should be aware of is many people hold lots of cultural bias relative to arranged marriage. However, people within the culture where arranged marriages happen often see it very differently. And I've learned to see it very differently through talking with students of mine. I had a couple of students from India that I talked about this with. And I have a whole different appreciation for it. Now that I have suspended my deeper biases relative to arranged marriages. So the thing that I want to say about gender roles and sexuality that I'm going to ask Naji to chime in a few minutes relative to this is when I was doing this and looking at this, this is again another clip from the book. I started to think about, wow, we really are an incredibly immodest society. You know, a few years ago, it was all the rage for adolescents, young adults to walk around with half of their midriff showing, or for guys for half of their butts hanging out of their pants. I mean, you know, it was just what they did. And you know, it's like, wow, we really are an incredibly immodest society. Naji, you want to talk a little bit about these slides and your reaction, your
Sure,
family's reaction?
it was very kind of shocking, but at the same time surprising to see, you know, people kissing. For example, when me and Amal walking down the hallway, you know, we'd see a girlfriend kissing her boyfriend. That these kind of things that you know, we always grew up learning that it's not inappropriate and you're not supposed to see things like this, and it should, you know, like it was shocking, especially when my parents would look at it, you know, the whole family walking together and we would see something like this. It's like my parents want to stop us from looking, but at the same time, you know, it's there.
Yeah, it's there. Yeah. 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 How do you and Amal feel about it now? Do you still feel the same way? Is it still as much of a problem for you, or?
Not really. We get used to it, you know. It happens every day that we just walk past.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and I think for us, if we think about the fact that, you know, it's been in the past and I don't know, in terms of time, but it wasn't always the case in this country that you would see same-sex couples walking down the street, arm in arm, hand in hand, etc. And now that's totally accepted. So there's a lot of cultural shift that happens in any culture. And also responses within ourselves, like you said. Now, you know, now you see this and it's like, yeah, okay, this is just what it is. And that happens. Cultural beliefs, cultural values, cultural views are not static. They change, they evolve, they merge. And as I said, the more superficial expressions of culture are more likely to change more quickly. I think that's all I want to say about that. I could go on, but we don't have time.
Okay, we're free to, people who have to leave just because it's 7:35, we can stay on as long as people would like to. We will make a recording available and we will send the presentation deck out to all the registrants as well as an evaluation. So just wanted to pipe in there for that. Should I go to the next slide?
Sure.
Okay.
Sorry, just to make sure. I have to run because I'm actually at my job place. I just took off this time. If that's okay.
Thank you very much, Naji, for joining us and for all your help with this and
No problem.
all your comments and willingness to share. Thank you.
Anytime. I appreciate it, and it's nice to meet you, Greg.
Yes, likewise.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Take care. Thank you, Naji.
Bye, Naji.
Bye.
I have just 3 more slides that I'm going to go through very, very quickly. The proverb that I put down here is, this is gender roles. So a woman's place is in the home, and that the pictures that I have put up go along with another slide, which is, which goes along with another proverb, which is extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures. And Naji's family is a much more traditional family where a woman's place generally is in the home, especially when there's young kids. However, and what was going on in Syria was extraordinary, and it did call for extraordinary measures. So this is Adiba going to, I think she was a judge, to try and pay a bond to get her husband and his brothers released. And you see the reaction in the taxi, the picture on the right of the taxi driver. Yeah, 2 ladies in a taxi at night heading to the prison during a war. It's short, and it sort of says that this was an extraordinary thing that Adiba did. And so I think that when we have in our head notions of what would be typical or is typical, we have to look at who the person is, what other circumstances are existing, what other circumstances have existed, and not make assumptions about whether they're going to be in their traditional role or whether or not they're going to, move from that role. Next slide is one that I just wanted to say a couple things about, and this is about child rearing practices. Child rearing practices around the world are very, very different. And it's one place where we in the United States think that we're doing it right. And we think that we can tell everybody else how to do it. And that even becomes codified into our system, which I'll share more about. The reason that I put this book up here, Our Babies Ourselves, I think is probably one of the most important books on child rearing practices that I have ever read. It's written by an anthropologist, Meredith Small, I think her name is. Yeah, Meredith Small. It's called Our Babies Ourselves. It's old. I don't know if you can still get it. I didn't look it up. She is a cultural anthropologist. And what all of her research shows is that how we raise our children is reflective of the culture that we come from. and our child rearing practices within a culture are designed to create the type of individual needed and valued within that culture. And these practices often have nothing to do with what is best for the infant. And I think about this in this country relative to breastfeeding. We all kind of know now, wasn't the case when I was breastfeeding my kids, but we all kind of know now that breastfeeding is in fact best for the babies. But we have this notion of how long we are to do it. Why? Why? It has nothing to do with anything. Why? I can't tell you how many times I still hear people, yeah, they're a year old and they're still breastfeeding. It's like, yes, so what? Another place that this happens that you might be able to appreciate is the whole notion of co-sleeping. What has come up in this book and what the research shows is collectivist cultures are more likely than individualistic cultures to have a co-sleeping arrangement. It could be with a baby, it could be with it could be with a family bed, as they do in most of the rural parts of Bhutan. And those co-sleeping practices are prevalent in collectivistic cultures who are raising kids for a group orientation. In this country, people think it's illegal. And I heard this from a relative of mine who, anyway, so I had to go investigate. Is it illegal in this country to, sleep with one's infant? And what I discovered is, no, it is not illegal. The question is whether or not it is really endangering to a child or not. And there have been cases brought against parents where a child who was co-sleeping was later found dead. There have been cases where they have tried to prove homicide against the parents, and they have tried to prove that there was unintentional homicide due to asphyxiation or positional asphyxiation because of co-sleeping, which only means that the child could have been sleeping on their back instead of on their stomach as opposed to on their back. So anyway, are there more kids who die in co-sleeping arrangements? Well, that's hard to track down. Probably not, because there is actually more co-sleeping around the world because there's more collectivistic cultures who have more kids than there are individualistic cultures having kids. Anyway, it's one of those things that we hold that is no co-sleeping as though it makes perfect sense. Does it? I don't know. The data is not there. The data does support that sleeping on one's back, a child sleeping on their back is less likely to die of SIDS, but that's all we really know. Anyway, so child rearing practices. Watch out for those deeply held biases, I'm going to say, or beliefs relative to child rearing practices, because there's a lot we think is the law and it may not be. Communication and language. All I'm going to say is there is communication which is direct, there's communication that's indirect, there's communication that's verbal, there's communication that's nonverbal, and then there's idioms, which is something something different entirely. This is an example of Naji had shoveled walk for the woman who lived upstairs. When he went upstairs to see her afterwards, she offered him some money, and he says, "Oh no, I can't accept it." And then she says, "Okay," and puts it away. And this was a missed communication, because in fact, when you offer somebody something in Syrian culture, you're supposed to offer it more than once before it is accepted, and she didn't. So watch out when you think you understand what's being said, to make sure you really know what's being said, because it could be quite other than what you're hearing and what you're taking in. This is a quick summary. Working where there's large cultural distance is difficult. There are times when our biases are going to sneak out. Never underestimate the role of trauma or culture. Generalizations about a cultural group are important, but only the beginning. Remember, there's as many differences within a group as there are between groups. One size does not fit all. Never make assumptions. Always talk about differences. Exercise cultural humility and ask questions. Be culturally inquisitive. So, your questions.
So Maddie, do we have some questions from the chat?
There wasn't any questions, there was just a conversation.
Oh, okay. Well, we don't have as many people on, so if you'd like to ask the question live, you may unmute yourself. I'm going to stop sharing. Excuse me.
Hi, I'm assuming that Afghanistan has a pretty flexible approach to time. But do you know offhand, in that, linear time versus flexible time, where Afghanistan falls?
I have no idea.
I would say it's similar to, Syria, Iraq. It's event-based.
Mhm.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Kate?
Been told to expect a family that may have no English, and although there are translators who will be helping, I am expecting that they will not be available 100% of the time. And I'm wondering how to best demonstrate cultural humility and to ask questions. Are there good gestures? Are there good ways of doing this when the English, the shared language, is very limited in your experience? Because I live fairly close to where we're going to be settling our family, and I have the feeling that I may be the person who shows up on their doorstep at the random time when they randomly need some help.
I found that having the more in-depth discussions about things was pretty impossible in the beginning. I tried it once. It was a dismal failure. So I'd make sure to save those deeper discussions, those real discussions, to when you do have a translator. I also discovered in working with people in this country for whom English is not their first language and whose language skills are marginally adequate, but not quite, that I found myself using lots of I'll show yous and hand gestures. You know, I would walk somebody to the refrigerator and show them what it was I wanted to tell them. Or so, you know, using hand gestures and communicating that way, you can get a lot accomplished that way, actually. I mean, it's amazing what things, how much you can communicate when you're talking relative to things, and that you can actually get done by hand gestures and single words.
Even if the fathers in these families are interpreters for the U.S. Army, they have rough and ready English, and nuance is not part of their game. So you really do have to be very careful to make sure that they really understand.
Yeah, I always, you know, I have tried only recently with Najee have I stopped trying to think of simplistic ways of saying things. But that's something that I always kept in mind. And when it got to the point where Ibrahim would say, send me a text, because he could sort that out more easily sometimes than even a phone conversation. But I would keep things short, you know, use simple language. And that helps a lot.
Yeah, even in doctor's appointments, sometimes if you're just there and there's a frightened refugee looking at you like, what is he talking about? You can just put what the doctor says in simple English and
Right.
it clicks.
Yeah. I remember taking Adiba to get a chest X-ray without an interpreter, and you know, so I had to explain what they were doing. You know, we had our phones, and I was saying, you know, I was showing her the camera of her chest, and you know, I took her into the room and, you know, demonstrated taking her clothes off, and you know, all of that kind of stuff. So it's amazing what you can do with, you know, some nonverbal language and a few
Yes.
quick words.
And I hope everybody who is a medical advocate who drives and goes in with the refugee family, if it's a woman and you have to have a phone interpreter, please ask for a woman interpreter.
Right. Or even if it's an in-person interpreter, which some clinics will have.
Yeah, because there
Yep.
there are some really bad miscommunications when there are male interpreters dealing with women's issues.
And we always made sure that wherever we were taking them knew in advance if they needed a female interpreter or if they needed a male interpreter, so that wasn't left to chance.
Right.
There are a couple of questions in the chat. One, or actually a comment, and this is a good one. Don't use thumbs up gesture, rude in Afghanistan. That is true. However, a lot of the Afghan SIVs who worked with the American military got used to the thumbs up because it's such a common gesture in our culture. So and it's a really hard one to get rid of because we do it so much. And the other question was, should we try to learn a little of their language? As the oldest son of 2 retired foreign language teachers, I say absolutely. Go on YouTube, learn how to say good morning, good night, hello, how are you?
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, we have a rule in our family. If we go to a country where we don't speak the language, we learn the common phrases because it's courteous and you're more likely to be respected, especially if you're American.
I'm wondering, my dogs, I'm sorry. So I had as a child, I lived in South Korea in the early 70s when it was still very much a developing nation, and we lived on the economy. And the Koreans sort of scooped me up and ran around with me and gave me candy. And you know, I would not do that with strange children. But I'm wondering about sort of what the cultural expectation is of the, you know, like, should strange adults be warm and friendly to children, or should they be like, keep their distance? Like, what's the sort of permeability of the bubble for the family?
I mean, I have my own interpretation of that, and I'd be curious for Judy's answer, but I like to keep things neutral so you can kind of feel it out. Because sometimes Americans come across as overly friendly and obnoxious when we think we're being perfectly happily friendly. And, you know, when it comes to children, you know, I would just kind of, you know, follow the lead. And, you know, I mean, even within American culture, there are so many different subcultures. I mean, like, I'm Italian, we pick everybody up and hug everybody, but Germans don't do that usually. So you put that on top of the fact that we're commonly American, like, you know, let me flip it actually. One of my clients is a senior citizen from Iraq, and he was walking in his neighborhood with his wife, and he saw a baby in a baby carriage, and he walked up to the baby and kissed its head, because it is totally acceptable to do that in Iraq. The mother of that child freaked out. And so we had to explain to him, yes, babies are adorable, but in this country, you don't touch somebody else's baby unless you have permission, you know? So I guess that's kind of what I'm thinking of when you ask that question, because they may be like, oh, here's my baby, you know, handle my baby. Or they may want to like know you a little bit more before you handle the children affectionately. Judy?
Yeah, and I think I have two comments. One is, I think there's a difference with a man versus with a woman. And I also think that the best policy is probably to ask, would it be okay if I gave you a hug? And that goes for adults as well as kids. And, you know, respect their answer. Sometimes you can tell from body language, don't touch me, you know, but there are other times when just ask.
Yes, Carol? You're muted.
Okay, and I just wanted to say, the teens who arrive, they're not cute and cuddly, and you're not going to want to pick them up and hug them because nobody wants a teen. But I would ask sponsors to keep an eye on them, and if they become more and more withdrawn, try to figure out something that they relate to with which you can draw them out, like art lessons for somebody who's drawing cartoons, or music or something, because teens just have it the hardest when they come over. I've seen this with Cambodian kids as well as with Iraqi kids.
No, I would agree with you in my experience. The 5-year-olds will learn English in 5 minutes. The 15-year-olds are going to take longer, and they have American high school culture to deal with. So I totally agree with you on that.
Cindy, you've had your hand up.
Oh, sorry, Cindy.
You got to unmute yourself though.
Good. I have a question. Earlier you were talking about, you and Najee, is that his name? You were talking about racism, and he was saying how he felt like there was not enough conversation to, you know, to really let him understand the way it was here.
Right.
I mean, we've come across this as well. We've had 3 families from Africa. But I was just wondering, what would you do differently? And who would do this in your group? Who would have the conversation? Would you find someone who's recently resettled or has been here a few years? Would someone in your group do it? How would you handle it now, knowing that, you know, what Najee has said?
I think there are several of us in the group who could easily have had that kind of conversation with them. I mean, I certainly would feel comfortable having that kind of conversation. You know, I think it obviously has to be somebody who really understands the depth of how discriminatory and racist this society really is, obviously, to have that conversation. And, you know, I wish I had talked to them, for instance, before they went to school about, Amal, are you worried that, you know, your people are going to say things to you or respond to you because you're wearing a hijab, and, you know, are you afraid, and et cetera, et cetera. And I wish I had that similar conversation with them when we were trying to get them to ride the bus. Just, yeah, out with it. Yeah. And what Najee didn't share, and what Reem also talked about, was that, you know, arriving for Najee and his family, arriving on the night that Trump was elected, they had been watching YouTube videos of Trump, and they were terrified. And they also, a lot of stuff was coming at them relative to being like, are you Arabs? You know, it was all the classic post 9/11 stuff that was still very alive and well, and or sick, as the case may be, coming at them. And I heard from Najee recently that Adiba was walking down the street alone. And I don't know whether it was West Hartford or Manchester. I think it was Manchester. And some man came up and said something to her about being Arab, and spit right on the ground in front of her. And, you know, all this, I feel awful that we never talked about the likelihood that this kind of stuff could happen. And because then there was no opening for them to talk with us about the fact that it had happened. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions? It's a little bit after 8.
I really appreciate all of you staying till the bitter end.
And I appreciate that resettlement from this angle, from our preoccupations and prejudices, was addressed. It's really helpful.
Okay, people are starting to say goodbye. So thank you all. As I said earlier, I will send the presentation out to everyone who was registered, and the recording will also be made available hopefully relatively soon. I'll also send out an evaluation with the presentation. So
thank you very much.
thank you who were still here. We had a lot more people before, but we appreciate you staying late very much.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Oh, you're welcome.